Hello everyone, welcome to next instalment of War on the ISP. As promised, I wanted to go through all the different organisations that have basically given sort of shelter and succour to the integrated system plan becoming the completely worse than useless report that it currently is, that's totally debased our debate about energy and railroaded our planning system into hugely excessive expenditure on a system that probably won't work. And so the Market Commission, first just to briefly explain what the Market Commission is. It's a strange acronym, AEMC, I might call it that at some point, but the Market Commission is the rule-making body. Last time I spoke about the Australian Energy Regulator, they're the rule enforcement agency, so they're kind of like the police force. The Market Commission is sort of more like the Parliament, if you like, or the facilitators of the Parliament that actually decides on the laws and rules that get enforced. So now they have also, I think, an extremely high bar in terms of integrity and transparency. And I think actually their statutory obligations to serve the long-term interests of energy consumers is at least as strong as any of the other market bodies. So we're going to be examining today basically things that they have done in the process of making rules that I think are huge, unforgivable, kind of essential breaches of trust. So I have three things that I want to point to. The first one sort of connects from the story we've had earlier about Transgrid, about HumeLink, Grant King, and that process. The Market Commission has basically changed a rule in a way that I think just literally paves a super highway for corruption right into the heart of the planning process. And so it connects directly to that story. So I'll mention that briefly first. The second one that I want to mention is the one to really absolutely hang your hat on, because it involves the Market Commission breaking the law. Right? There are laws, the National Electricity Law, that sets down what the Market Commission can and can't do and what they have to take note of when making the rules. They make the rules. The law sits above that. And they've broken, so far as I can tell, I think they've broken the law in order to do a favour for Chris Bowen, the current energy minister, which has very favourable short-term political consequences for him and his government. So that's the one that because it's a breach of the law, so far as I can tell, it alone, I think, constitutes a breach of trust, which is irrecoverable without someone acknowledging it by stepping down, basically. And the third one is another case, abandoning, in this case, a terms of reference for a document they produce, which basically should be giving some transparency and clarity for consumers about the direction we're heading, and does the opposite now. It now just preens the plumage of the integrated system plan, and I think that's appalling, and the conditions in which that's come about, I think, really speaks volumes. So there's a quick three highlight summary. That's where I'm going. Together, I just don't think there's any way that you can stare into this set of facts about what's occurred and not reach the conclusion that the trust in the Market Commission that we should have, that we need to have, has been absolutely terribly broken. And that's why I think Anna Collier should resign. So let's start with that first story and how it stems from the recent previous chapters that we've had. The integrated system plan, it has become a slave to government policy, and not just sort of high-level policy about trying to have reliable, cost-effective electricity, but every little particular thought bubble and brain fart that comes from politicians, like having 9 gigawatts of offshore wind in Victoria, like 82% renewable energy by 2030. And this is the one that I really have hung my hat on. The 82% target, it came from Reputex. It was dreamed up by, it was a product of that document before Labor came to office, all right? So, and it's a twin, essentially, of the $275 meant to be a projected outcome of adopting the policy of rewiring the nation. Of course, $275 off your power bills is the laughing stock of energy policy at the moment, projections, because it hasn't come about, it's 2025 now. But 82% has been elevated into deity, essentially, because it's been written into the core of the integrated system plan. It's the binding constraint in the development of most of the build-out. So it's basically become beyond reproach, can't be critiqued, because every single scenario in the ISP considers it. Now, this has huge consequences for the regulatory process, and I've called already for the resignation of Grant King, carefully not alleging that he knew and designed it to be this way, but he gave basically a piece of formal advice in his capacity as the chair of the Climate Change Authority to make this 82%, which again should be the laughingstock of energy projections, into a credible-ish, serious-sounding number that the government should aim for and adopt as formal policy. And by adopting it as formal policy, a major project, HumeLink, one of the biggest transmission projects we've ever built in Australia, has just limped over the regulatory hurdles to give a $5 billion windfall to Transgrid. Grant King went straight to Transgrid to take over the chairing of that company. And basically, I mean, the way that looks is just appalling. I don't know whether he designed it or knew that way, but if he had any inkling that he would be going for a job at Transgrid or wanted to benefit from Transgrid's later investments, and he had any inkling that his advice about the 82% renewable energy target, being made to look more serious and be adopted, would affect Transgrid's fortunes in the future, that is absolutely the picture-perfect postcard of what the wholesale corruption of the energy planning system looks like. So he may not have planned it, in which case he's done no deliberate wrong, but his position is untenable, being positioned to benefit from that sort of thing. So now the very first consultation where we had any opportunity to notice the significance of the 82%, the significance of Grant King's Climate Change Authority advice in forming that to become official adopted policy, the first and most important chance that anyone had to notice that was a consultation about an update to the ISP that whisked it into regulatory effect, which should have had a consultation, and that was skipped. The Australian Energy Regulator was requested by the market operator. All right, the market operator writes the ISP to skip that consultation, said, let's just do the update without any consultation. And of course, AEMO has had some relations with Transgrid, of course. They should be dived into by a Royal Commission, but AEMO asks the AER. The AER says, yes, that's fine, skip the consultation. We believe you. It doesn't really matter anymore because it's duplicative. That was what the AER said. And of course, it's not duplicative. And the Market Commission, actually, in response to a question on notice in the latest Senate inquiry, has confirmed that actually, no, this would have been the first time, as I'm saying to you now, the Market Commission has confirmed, the first time that the impact on the optimal development path, i.e. which projects for transmission get built, the first time that the impact of policy there is assessed would have been in that skipped consultation. Right now, so how is there any chance that we can forgive that series of events? Well, there is a final out, a final kind of disclaimer that the regulator might say, oh no, it's all fine, trust us, there's no problem here. And this is how it always tends to be, is they say, no, look, some other market body, they say it's fine too. And in this case, I'm turning to that instance. The Market Commission is the last market body on the end of this chain. And the Market Commission has passed a rule change request to make it normal, to always skip that consultation. And this was actually referred to by the market operator when they first requested they skip that consultation, right? They said, oh, look, they said two things in the most recent request to skip that consultation and break the rules there. One is they said we did it before, implying it was fine, all right? Ignoring the fact that the consumer panel at the time that occurred wrote in their report on the draft 2022 ISP, they wrote and said that it was a significant weakness in the ISP framework, that there wasn't any ability for any feedback to be considered in this feedback loop decision. So it's been flagged as a serious problem before, all right? So this idea there was a precedent that was smooth is completely disingenuous, because the consumer panel that should be looking after consumer interests, which AEMO and the market operator and the regulator and the market commission, they should all be doing that. But anyway, the consumer panel was upset by it, and that was ignored. But they also said, and they foreshadowed, oh, you know what, the market commission's considering this rule change request. When that rule change request goes through, we'll never have to do this consultation again. So it must be fine, right? And so now I'm coming to focus on this rule change because I think it is anything but fine. And I think it's, frankly, absolutely appalling. So why is it bad? Well, it's bad because it is a huge trade-off in essential protections for consumers to be able to detect and analyze what is driving these extra investments, which in many cases are premature, certainly in the case of HumeLink, to be able to see what was the change in new information and new policy that drove it. So it's an essential consumer protection. Now, in a moment of clarity and honesty, and the one thing that I would probably attribute to the Market Commission is that they do tend to be, I think where possible, more transparent and honest, I think, than I would say about the regulator. As I said, the regulator lied and continues to lie about the significance of this skip consultation, whereas the Market Commission, they acknowledge a trade-off, right? In making this rule change, they said that in front of the Energy Planning Regulation Committee, Wednesday, 23rd October, she said, one of the questions we considered at great length in our review was that of the balance between ensuring robust assessments of the costs of energy transition investment, but also with concerns about the length of the regulatory assessment process and planning process. All right, and so they used the word trade-off later on, all right? So what we're looking at in relation to this particular process was the trade-off between the value of additional consultation at that point in the process and a potential delay that was in effect built into the current process. So they've at least acknowledged there is a trade-off here. And I think they have reached absolutely the wrong decision here in deciding that was an effective trade-off to make. Why is it the case that that's a terrible trade-off to make? Because basically it is the only point now at which there would have been consultation and scrutiny of the integrated system plan when it gets all these new policies fed into it by government. All right, so the very path that we can see that's been exemplified by Grant King, although I don't think he planned and intended this way, but it's been exemplified by him, whereby some new policy gets agitated for or made more credible, some new policy is adopted by some government somewhere, and it has a direct impact on the integrated system plan's optimal development path. What transmission gets approved to be put onto consumers' bills straight away. There is now no step where we can be sure that that link gets examined in public before essentially all the hurdles, the regulatory hurdles, get passed. That means the checks can be signed, written out to transmission companies. And I think that's absolutely bizarre, absolutely insane that in a modern democracy we don't have any step where we get to check and examine the economic blueprint and whether it stacks up before we start signing the checks. Surely there has to be a point of consumer review. So, okay, let's just wind back. Come on, Aidan, let's steelman this for them. Why did they think it was okay to eliminate the only check and balance in this process? Why do they think it's okay to skip this final consultation that lets full economic approval just fly through straight away? Well, I think when we examine this, we get a clear picture which looks just even more appalling, right? So their excuse is this, all right? The final rule builds on those safeguards by ensuring that AEMO can have regard to the latest available information when it undertakes a feedback loop assessment, all right? This promotes best practice regulatory decision-making where AEMO is able to use updated information from the latest IASR in the draft ISP. Now, this comes from page 8 of the final determination of the improving the workability of the feedback loop rule change request. 7th of March 2024. Latest information is the excuse that's given. And I think that when you step back from this and examine what that is really saying, this makes things look even worse, all right? Because the excuse is here is, oh, okay, look, we need to have the latest information. Information is rapidly changing, right? It's some objective fact that we can trust and rely on. We'd want to have all the latest information compiled as quickly as possible. It's more important to have the latest stuff included than it is to be able to check the impact on the actual regulatory approval of transmission projects, right? Supreme importance on the latest information. And why does that look terribly, terribly suspect, in my opinion? And that's because the IASR, the Inputs, Assumptions and Scenario Report, has a huge volume of different assumptions and information built into it. The vast majority of which is extremely slow-moving projections of things like forecast future energy demand, right? Population growth changes, projections about how many people will be driving, electric vehicles in what year in the future, right? Now this information is not particularly urgently needing to be rapidly updated for a couple of reasons. First, it's a massive far-off future projection. If you get another year or two of data and that looks a little bit different to what you expected, it doesn't necessarily mean that on just a couple of years you should update the next 25 years of projections with radical changes, right? That's only 2 more data points. You're doing long-term projections, right? So you should be very cautious about making sudden big changes on latest bits of information for those kind of long forward-looking projections. The second thing is that we already have a mechanism for accounting in inherent uncertainty about those important forward-looking projections of all that information. And that's in scenarios. We know that we don't have a perfect crystal ball about what population growth will be or the uptake of consumer energy resources. And so we have different scenarios that account for kind of high and medium and low scenarios. Or, as the case may be, we have sort of high, extremely high, and totally off the charts bonkers scenarios. That's sort of how the ISP is today. But we do basically have different scenarios for the purpose of accounting for uncertainty. So there's no reason to think, given that we have multiple scenarios accounting for a bit of uncertainty in far forward-looking projections, that there's anything particularly rapidly emerging that we will need to suddenly change. Except for policy, right? Policy changes is the only thing that gets railroaded through across all 3 scenarios that is assumed to have perfect and complete instantaneous effect all the way through to the future. So if a government says, you know what, I'd like to have this much of this technology, like offshore wind installed in this date, all of a sudden, all 3 scenarios must have that. All right, like or 82%. All right, so we're going to now assume that all scenarios have to have this fraction of energy provided by renewable energy in this date. So when you stand back and look at it, this idea that the latest information is some kind of objective, neutral, factual thing that we should definitely incorporate as quickly as possible, over and above the scrutiny of how it impacts things, is completely backwards. Completely backwards. In fact, at the time of this, the latest ISP, basically all those sort of, the rapid pace of the energy transition moving afoot, all that hype was perfect nonsense, because actually the uptake of renewable energy in the grid and the pace of investment decisions being made by the private market was slowing down. Nothing was moving at a faster pace. The only thing that was moving at a faster pace was the aspirations of governments and their, lofty declarations of what they would start targeting. That basically served to overturn the real reality of what was happening, the neutral information. So rapid developments in political aspirations are basically the special payload that carries these very tenuous regulatory decisions, such as HumeLink, over the finish line, that gets their investments done faster, their checks signed sooner. And in light of that, as I've said, Grant King, I think, He may not have known it, but his position is untenable. He should resign. And in light of that, that the AEMO asked for it and the regulator said, oh, it's fine if that consultation's been done. But at the moment, reading in the cold light of day how this entire argument now looks, that we need to rush this latest information through, given what it actually rushes through and the impacts that had, looks disgraceful, looks extremely suspect. I think that in the Royal Commission that certainly should come to get to the bottom of this, anyone and everyone who's actually been associated with promoting that argument to say we need to have the latest updated information, they should be the first to go before the Royal Commission to explain, did you understand what information this actually would be? Did you understand which changes would be coming rapidly and quickly? How these would impact the scenarios? How the scenarios worked? And look, hey, I won't be surprised at all if we end up with just another queue of people saying, oh, I didn't really understand how the ISP works. Maybe it's the case. But hey, I'm sick of people getting away with this excuse that they don't really understand how the ISP works. People need to take responsibility, particularly if they're in a position of formulating important rules, for actually how the ISP works. And at the moment, this rule change has basically, like I said, it's now paved a superhighway for corruption into the heart of the planning process. Because there's one type of information that has a faster, sooner, harder, more direct impact on all the scenarios, and that's policy changes. So anyone that can get in the ear of any government around Australia and get them to declare a target, some mandate for a certain thing, it doesn't have to be realistic, doesn't have to be least cost, just has to be declared, and then it will forcibly railroad that into the ISP in all scenarios and distort and warp all their cost-benefit analyses in a certain way. And to the extent that's predictable, and that certain people can know that get certain benefits from that, as, and I don't know, but potentially someone like Transgrid with a $5 billion project that's just had a cost blowout might know that forcing more renewable energy into the system would increase the perceived benefits of that. That is an open door to wholesale and complete and utter corruption of the energy planning system. And it's inexcusable that that is what's been opened through this rule change. I just can't see any legitimate argument this is actually in consumers' interests. It literally is incapable of conceiving any bad actors in the system. It just assumes with perfect trust any of the transmission companies, any of the renewable energy companies that might stand to benefit, that no one could possibly have a profit motive trump their interest in the genuine best outcome for consumers. And so I think it's really appalling. And so what did they say as their excuse that lets them get away with this? Well, their excuse in the actual final decision is just that it's unlikely that consultation on the draft ISP will result in changes to the status of actionable ISP projects that might request a feedback loop assessment in the 6-month window before the draft and the final ISP. Their excuse is basically consultation doesn't matter. It was never going to change anything anyway. That I think is pretty damning. It says that, it's basically affirming that they never meant for this consultation to have any useful impact. And this consultation, like as I said, Transgrid's key project HumeLink, it had blown out in cost by about 50%. All right, there was an absolutely crucial new bit of information that should have pushed it back. It should have pushed it out of contention of being advanced, right? There were literally decision rules written into previous draft ISPs that said if there's a material increase in costs, this doesn't get advanced at this pace, push it back. But now, basically, what the Market Commission has said is there's no chance that consultation on this step between this new information or policy changes that helped override that cost increase could result in a change in the ISP. And I think that's pretty appalling. And I think it's extremely appalling, particularly because of a massive double standard in that same 6-month window between the draft and the final ISP, there were changes to actionable projects in the ISP. And in fact, a whole bunch more of them got added. There were 5 new transmission projects that were suddenly brought forward into this actionable set that could then go ahead and get regulatory approval for their funding straight away. And they included ones that we developed by Transgrid, such as Sydney Ring South. I think that's one of the big ones in New South Wales. Part of that whole connection to Snowy Hydro, right? So if we could not conceive of a situation where this draft to final consultation period could notice or respond to a problem and a cost increase and push something back, why is it that in the case of, and they literally say they've identified lower cost options, in the case of a consultation with other stakeholders, like the guys that want to build more transmission, if they notice there's a lower cost option, then suddenly they can bring all their things forward. And there'd be no opportunity for anyone to be able to consult on that because it's done in between the draft and the final ISP. Simply put, there is no pretense now. There is no pretense that we have serious consultation about the economic business case for the transmission projects. None whatsoever. And I think that massively breaches trust. There is no way that the Market Commission, I think, can say they've discharged their duties to protect the long-term interests of consumers and made it this way, that there is no consultation that can cross-examine the business case for these major transmission projects. So let's move on. That's just number one, and that's not the one I wanted to hang my hat on. The one I really wanted to hang my hat on is probably a little more simple than that. As I've said, the ISP is worse than useless. It's divorced from reality because of its slavish adherence to the assumption that all government policy is always realised in every scenario. There could have been things that would help and prevent it from falling into such a terrible situation. One of those things might be a proper, thorough, transparent and rigorous review of how the ISP was functioning. Now, there's been an integrated system plan review. This is the integrated system plan review that was kicked off by the ministers, right? The energy ministers from around Australia. And it was very much at their control, their beck and call. They did not go out for public consultations. They got to choose their own selected stakeholders with whom they could consult. And still, this review that ministers had perfect control of identified, frankly, fatal flaws in the ISP. In particular, and these are big ones, right? Like, the assumption that all consumers will just buy huge amounts of electricity generators like solar panels and storage devices like batteries and then gift them back to the grid without the capital cost needing to be considered. That was identified as, I quote, problematic. Doesn't adequately consider the trade-offs, right? And also the assumption that we'll have gas firming, all right, that will be okay. This has been tested now, and we've discovered that the assumptions that we'll be able to have a firming capacity from our current system is just not true. It's designed for steady state operation, not these massive surges to cover this huge output through poor weather patches. So the ISP review that the ministers got to perfectly control, essentially, and massage the language of, that review still identified fatal flaws, but it was tucked at the bottom of a drawer and kept totally private. The severity of those fatal flaws was hidden from public view, and the ministers basically released a sort of double kid-gloved kind of softy response to that review that kind of adopted all the proposed solutions without identifying clearly what the problems were. Now, that review has just come to light because it was tabled in the recent Senate inquiry. But now, again, huge breach of trust in the ministers for not making that review more clearly public. My issue with the Market Commission is there was supposed to be another review, a review conducted by the Market Commission. The Market Commission's purpose in life pretty much is to serve the long-term interests of energy consumers. And we would expect if they did their job properly, that would be a thorough, proper, very transparent review, like they do for full rule change requests, right? In 2 different stages, they go with an issues paper, they get lots of stakeholders to feedback on that, they write a draft, they get more feedback on that, they write a final. Multiple stages, totally transparent. Anyone can write in with any submission they want to. That would have been the sort of review that would have transparently and completely exposed how the ISP had come right off the rails and had just, this slave to government policy without testing any of it. And that review is meant to be happening right now. All right, due to be reported by July 2025. All right, so a serious review like that would be happening. The beginning stages, when we kicked off probably a few months ago, would be seeing the first stages of these draft papers or issue papers being responded to with full consultation, published on the AEMC website. That's what I would expect from the AEMC. The review didn't happen because the AEMC passed a rule change. Okay, their core business. This is what they do. They write the rules. They passed a rule change to push back their review 2 years, which happens, coincidentally, to be comfortably past the current election. If it was happening now, right in the run-up to the election, the fundamental flaws in the ISP would be exposed by this rule change review. But that's not happening because the Market Commission agreed to a rule change review that pushed them back 2 years. Now, this is frankly and transparently absolutely not in the interests of consumers. And we know that, right? Because in the final determination of the rule change, AEMC, I mean, credit to them for the one thing they do well is transparency, right? So their own final decision says that in contrast, consumer groups expressed a preference for the AEMC undertaking a review of the ISP framework in a timely manner, as in not delaying it, right? And they go on to list all the different consumer groups, including Centre for Independent Studies was one of those ones that put in a review to that effect. They've ignored the consistent petition of people representing the interests of consumers. So how did they come to the decision to actually pass this? Well, they sided with some other stakeholders, all right? Stakeholders were the Australian Energy Regulator, the Australian Energy Market Operator, and the Energy Networks lobby. I'm God's back, to be honest. I just at this point, you look at the pattern that's emerging of these organisations basically turning away from their statutory duty to serve the interests of consumers, but then turning to each other to create the impression that there has been sufficient consultation and there is a plethora of stakeholders. All right, the energy networks, it's their transparent interest to make sure there is no accountability and checks and frameworks in place. And so they have just gone ahead here and basically said, let's not change the system that we've just got the open gate to no review, right? They don't want to change that at all. Let's not review the current system. Let's not expose the superhighway for corruption into the heart of the planning system. Let's just keep it on going. And the regulator and the AEMO, who I've already said have tried to rush through this transgrid project and break rules and lie about the reasons for the breaking rules in the process. We now have the Market Commission saying, yeah, those guys, I'm with them. They matter more than the organisations that are representing consumers' interests. And I think that is basically unforgivable. But there's more, right? That's not what I really, really want to hang my hat on. How did we get here? How did this rule change request come about? And this is the really, really serious stuff. And it's because this rule change request came from Chris Bowen, who's the current Federal Energy Minister and the chair of the Ministerial Council. It includes all the states as well. So he issued the rule change request. That is transparent. His signature's on the page. So he requested it. There's no doubt that he made that request. So it is sort of a favour for him. But he didn't just request a new rule change request for this. He asked that the AEMC tack this onto another major rule change request that was already going through and was already going through on a fast track. All right. Now, this, so far as I can tell, breaks the law. All right, there are laws written about this kind of thing, and in citing why this rule change request was going through in a fast track, the AEMC names and says the section of the law, this is the National Electricity Law, section 96A for fast track rules, where previous public consultation by electricity market regulatory body or an AEMC review, right? So the title pretty much says it all. You can fast track a rule change if you've already had a thorough consultation process before, right? Basically, there's been a big project by one of the other market bodies or the AEMC, a review. And in this case, they've tacked it onto one of these ones that has had an AEMC review, all right? And that's one of the parts of the TIPR, Transmission Investment Planning Review, right? So that was a big review, and there were recommendations in this big rule request that had been thoroughly consulted on before. But it is beyond dispute. In the actual request, all right, it is said that and this is the request that has Chris Bowen's signature on it, the request says, in addition to the AEMC's TPIR, Transmission Plan Investment Review, in addition to that review's recommendations, the Commonwealth is proposing amendments to the NER, that's National Electricity Rules, to delay the AEMC's ISP review by 2 years. It's crystal clear. This was not part of that earlier review. The law gives the AEMC to fast track something because it's already received that chapter of review. So far as I can tell, definitely do not apply to this special favour requested by the Minister to push back the review that would have exposed the terrible flaws, the fatal flaws in what the ISP has now become. I can't see any legitimate defence for that. But okay, let me try. Okay, so surely they had a reason, Aidan. Try to steelman this for us. Like, what is the actual... Surely they put down some excuse, right? And the excuse is this. The excuse is that the Commonwealth has already initiated the R review, right? So to finish Chris Bowen's second sentence in his request, right? This change will allow better alignment with the Commonwealth's supercharged ISP review and provide time for current reforms to embed. So that was the excuse, is that don't worry, don't need to have the statutory authority, the AEMC, do their proper, full, transparent review according to their statutory obligations. Trust us, the ministers have this covered. We've got our own special ministerial review. It's called the Supercharged ISP Review. Let's just run with that for a few years. And you can come and mop up, once that's all embedded down, right? Like, again, this assumes we should all have perfect trust in the ministerial review. And again, like none of the other actual people submitting in consumers' interests to this rule change review bought that, right? Like, that wasn't from any consumer groups a view that was actually taken, right? So that trust doesn't exist. But more than that, since we've seen what's happened with that review, that did even find fatal flaws, even though the ministers could pick their favourite people to consult with, that was left at the bottom of a drawer and not exposed to public view, while the 2024 ISP came out with full fanfare announcing they've got reliable electricity, when the reliability mechanism we know now wasn't actually going to be in place. The gas firming wouldn't work. This is an appalling breach of trust, because it's so clear that the ISP review that the ministers controlled was kept suppressed in the lead up to the election to allow this kind of narrative to remain intact and not be exposed to public criticism. So even if the Market Commission bought that view at the time, the law is your friend. Follow the letter of the law, which says that you've got to put this through the full rule change request process and consult on it thoroughly. But you couldn't do that, because if you did your own separate rule change request for this, it would have been knocked back, because no one on isolation of that request would have seen that's a good thing for consumers to do. We also have, by the way, just a final sort of nail in the coffin, we do have freedom of information, request information from the Market Commission. We think we have the handwritten note from a meeting with the Department of Climate Change and Energy, which is the Minister's department, where it's stated that the Commonwealth is very interested in support option 1 subject to. Now, option 1 is one of the choices in the TIPR review that had to be chosen from. So they were making a decision about sort of which option to pick. And the Commonwealth basically said, let's pick one. We'll agree to support that subject to, and there's a big redaction section. That next bit is redacted, and the excuse used was intergovernmental relations, which is code for what lies under this black box would potentially upset the Ministerial Council, breach the confidentiality of the Ministerial Council for Energy, which has state governments and the federal governments on it. So we know pretty clearly that if this is, a directive from the ministers, and Chris Bowen's been part of it, his signature's on the page, we can see that the AEMC wants to hide this. I think it is. I think it's indefensible. I think there is no excuse for breaking the law, specifically the law that says there needs to be certain steps of transparency. And this has had the effect of shielding the ISP directly in the run-up to an election of the criticism it desperately needed. Right? And it's allowed the renewables are cheapest narrative to basically run longer, unscathed. And for shielding the ISP from that necessary, essential criticism, I think the AEMC absolutely has to acknowledge there's no defence for that. And so Anna Collier, on that one alone, I think should step down. We need to be able to trust that the rules are followed, and in this case, they weren't. And it looks like they were broken to do a politically helpful favour for the minister or ministers of the day, and that's unforgivable. All right, there's a final one. There is yet still more. Like I said, this narrative that renewables are cheapest, which the ISP is absolutely not fit to support, it has done nothing to test that at all. That could be further tested by what was quite a brilliant and quite very good document, an artifact in the energy ecosystem, and that is the Residential Electricity Price Trends Report. Right, and this was produced consistently for a number of years up to about 2021. And it has this fantastic terms of reference that was handed down by basically the Ministerial Council many years ago, back in 2011, I think there's been updates. But energy ministers agreed at the meeting of June 2011 to extend this reporting. They've asked for some reporting before. They were so happy they said, let's extend it. All right, as such, the Standing Council on Energy Resources, which supersedes the MCC, tasked the AEMC with this reporting on an ongoing, annual, and publicly available basis commencing in 2012. All right, and there's this fantastic terms of reference which sets out how this price trends report is meant to work. And so it says very clearly you're meant to kind of anchor it in the last complete financial year and then do 3 years forwards projections based on that. So you anchor it in fact of what we know and then try to project what you know 3 years forwards as the basis, to estimate into that future period. It says in the terms of reference that the accumulated time series data from this reporting should be presented in a consistent and comparable manner. Makes perfect sense. So you can see year on year how your projections actually panned out, whether it went somewhere higher, somewhere lower, which bits of the energy system. The report should include a factual description of the drivers of movement in electricity prices, illustrated by the forward estimates for each jurisdiction and at a national level. I mean, this is fantastic stuff. Which state's adding what to their system, who's building too much distribution, too much transmission, or not enough, or who has expensive wholesale energy needs. All right, if possible, analysis and commentary should be provided on the main components underlying any significant price movements in each jurisdiction. Like this is excellent stuff. This is exactly what we need. Objective, consistent annual reporting on what's driving electricity based in factual reality, projected forward for all the jurisdictions to see who's adopting what's different between them, what can we see on the roadmap immediately ahead that is going to push things up or down. Brilliant document. At least in essence, it should be. And the previous versions of it, 2020 up to 2021, very, very helpful. Fantastic reference to say what made up the bill stack. Was it sort of, green fees and levies? Was it wholesale electricity cost? Was it network cost? Extremely, extremely useful. But then in 2022, it wasn't reported. It stopped, and there was a statement that was made, right? So AEMC put a statement on 1st December 2022. Of course, this is sort of the year of Ukraine, etc. And they said the AEMC will publish its next residential electricity price trends report mid 2023. Pushed back a year. This year has seen a period of unprecedented conditions for Australian electricity markets. Right, and they basically, without mentioning it, basically say Ukraine, right? So huge global events in fuel prices, and there's truth in that, right? There's serious truth. It did push up coal prices and gas prices massively, which flowed into wholesale costs quite a bit. Right, so that's their excuse there. They say we're gonna publish it a year later, which is breaching their terms of reference, which requires an annual thing. And quite frankly, I don't totally buy it. Like, I honestly think that given what the terms of reference laid out, best commentary, current year, all those parts, best efforts done transparently would have been very, very good and useful. And even if there weren't perfect projections about the wholesale cost, we would have been able to see that the wholesale cost was the wholesale cost and track what was happening with the network parts, which weren't affected by Ukraine war at all. So I don't really buy it, but hey, that's their first excuse to fob this off, which they gave at the start of December 2022. Of course, the other thing that happened in 2022, Labor got elected, all right? So, and of course, the renewable energy narrative and new, more vigorous updates. The 82% renewable energy target was adopted as official policy right this time. In fact, it was actually that day, same day. Gee, I hadn't realised that's a coincidence. All right, and then another year rolls around, right? And in July 2023, all right, so there's an update on the residential electricity prices report. And they say basically the AEMC will improve its residential electricity price trends report modelling with longer range forecast on electricity prices to better assist energy experts and policymakers with their decision making. All right, so, and they say following feedback from stakeholders shifting from the previous approach of a 1 to 3 year forecasting model. So they said, we've consulted with stakeholders, all well and good. Let's move on from this. And of course, what came out just recently in November 2024 was the most wholesale rejection in the letter and spirit of that terms of reference. It completely rejected, right? Like, it is a 10-year forecast, all right? It's a forecast of residential electricity prices. It's not anchored in a current historical year, all right? It's in the next year. It starts the next year. And it projects forward, assuming every fantasy of the integrated system plan comes true. All right? And they're transparent about this. They spell it out. They say that, yeah, we are assuming that we're not going to count any of the capital costs, right? For all these renewable energy resources, which make up, not renewable, any of the consumer energy resources, which make up all these crucial firming components of the energy mix. So it essentially is just now a puff piece for the ISP. It says if we buy into wholesale all of those assumptions, if we assume there's nothing wrong with any of those assumptions, this is, by the way, at the same time as we have this other ISP review that's been sitting unnoticed on the shelf, saying there are critical flaws in those assumptions. They've labelled these assumptions problematic. The AEMC comes out and says, oh, these assumptions seem fine. We'll just run with those and say, if you believe all of that, then maybe electricity prices will come down eventually in 10 years, just a little bit. Because they have not linked this to any of the previous few years of electricity price changes, which has seen a massive jump in electricity price, they sort of ignore all the awkward facts about this still being higher priced electricity to what they had and had projected during that interim period to be the case. So there's a massive gap. There's a gap of a few years, and electricity prices have soared higher. And the very document whose purpose should be to basically track what the main drivers are of electricity prices has just abdicated from that purpose completely and just become pure fan fiction for the ISP. assuming all the worst assumptions in it are impeccable and will come to pass, and plucked out a method by which prices might perceivably go down a bit from where they currently are if you buy everything in the ISP, which of course we now know we can't. And I think this is ridiculous. This is a betrayal of consumer interests. This piece, what it's become, it is a wholesale rejection of a very good terms of reference that's been abandoned. You'll see with the latest one, there is no new published terms of reference. The terms of reference were all published with the previous ones. There's been no replacement terms of reference, right? None at all. They've just seemingly posted this, this media release saying they're going to change their method. Centre for Independent Studies, we did go and follow up, and we asked, what stakeholders do they consult with? And we pressed them on it. And we got the same answer as usual. It's the energy ministers in the Ministerial Council and the regulator and the market operator. Here we have, again, basically in unison, creating the impression that there is broad consultation, there's buy-in from stakeholders. You have the market bodies who should be serving the long-term interests of consumers in lockstep with the ministers, seeming to basically paper over this massive leap in energy prices, protect from the necessary criticism this renewable energy narrative that says everything will push prices further down, and do nothing and shield from criticism. In fact, provide more buffers of support, more layers of agreement that all these assumptions in the ISP, they will come to pass. That this is all okay. When in fact, buried at the bottom of a drawer this whole time is a government commissioned review that said, no, these are problematic assumptions. They do not adequately assess the trade-offs. This is, again, just nail in the coffin stuff. It is impossible, staring into these facts, to not reach the conclusion that the market bodies, and in this case particularly the Market Commission, they have walked off the job. They have abandoned their obligation to consistently serve the long-term interests of energy consumers, which requires a degree of separation and independence from energy ministers, in favour of apparently doing exactly what will best shelter and protect that narrative from the criticism and transparency that they are meant to be providing. And I think for that, I can see no way of restoring the trust, overcoming the breach of trust that has occurred here, without someone acknowledging how bad that looks, how badly we've been betrayed, and stepping down. So there can be a new direction set wholeheartedly from the top of the Market Commission and the market bodies. There'll be more. I'm not done yet. I want to turn to the more details about how the market bodies have been moving in lockstep with the will of ministers and their untested, unproven policy ideas that are nothing to do with and should not be assumed to be consistent with the long-term interests of energy consumers. That'll come next when I return and come full circle and consider the position of the market operator, AEMO, and in particular the leadership there. But for the moment, there'll be more reinforcement to come. But for the moment, I think this is sufficient to hang a hat on and say the Market Commission has breached our trust, and Anna Collier should step down.